NAM is supposed to be very strong in order to face new challenges ahead. Today, we are here to discuss the relevance of NAM, or the non-aligned movement. Is it still necessary to have the non-aligned movement? Is it relevant to still have states who are not taking sides in the international struggle for dominance? With me here today is Dr. Ken Ahorsu. He's a senior research fellow of the Legon Center for International Affairs and Diplomacy. We also have Dr. Kingsley Opoku-Amaning. He is the former resident coordinator of the UN in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and many other African countries that he has served, including Chad and Ethiopia. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Yeah. As we always do, when we discuss these topics, we would like viewers to also join us. It is worldview. You have your views and how you would like to articulate it. Join us through the numbers 0243 158653. 0243 158653. We are also going to be live on Facebook. When you go to Facebook, you go to the search section, and then you type in Ghana Broadcasting Corporation, and you will join us live. And you can also send your contribution through Facebook, and it shall be read for the consumption of all. My name is Fidel Amachi Owusu, your regular host for the show. And so I move straight to Dr. Ahorsu. Doc, your opening remarks on NAM.
Yeah, NAM was important at some point in time, in the sense that we live in a community of states, and the way states were formed were different. What we call the traditional states, that are the states that were formed in North Europe, and those that were formed in North America and then Europe. And Australia and the rest, they follow the traditional trend of how states are formed. Normally, land is turned into capital, and the system arises out of that. As you rightly pointed out, from the late 1950s and the early 60s, then we have post-colonial states, or states that were colonies, eventually become independent states, and then they join. And the Cold War was a kind of encapsulating element, in the sense that it influenced the whole world, in the sense that in Africa, even the proxy wars that went on occurred in Africa. So you are either for the East or for the West, and there was effort from the East and the West as to influence all other people. So it was out of this logic that the idea came that, given the peculiar foundation of developing states or post-colonial states, they should be non-aligned, so that their developmental needs would be looked at purely from a functional perspective and not from a political perspective. So it was out of this logic that NAM was formed. But then the major question was that, was there any state actually which was non-aligned during the Cold War?
We'll come to that. Thank you very much. Doc, your opening remark on this topic.
Thank you very much. I fully endorse what my Dr. Ahorsu just said, but let me just add this. In my opinion, if you put into the context of the time, that development was a major development in the history of the world. We have had nearly centuries where the order of the day was hegemony. Strong nations had preferred to establish hegemonies, and weaker nations were either absorbed or were subordinated to these. This was the first time, and interestingly, if you place in the context that before then, in 1955, there had been the first resurgence to the Bandung Conference, where the newly emerging states had decided that they wanted to be able to work together, to have also a place in the international system. And clearly, if you consider that this is also something that followed part of the development, then NAM in the general perspective should be considered as a decision and an effort that was made by weak countries to be able to hold their own in a country in which the order of the day was hegemony. They wanted to be able to set up a system of solidarity in which their common interests were advanced, and that they will be able to bring change, demand and obtain change in a world in which they believe that their interests were being subordinated. In 1964, the second NAM, non-aligned, Bembela put it in a very succinct manner. He said that the NAM should be considered as a form of movement by which they are all refusing to be subordinated to bigger powers. And I think generally that was the whole phenomenon. The idea that they needed to hold their own, the idea that they wanted a change in the international system, and the idea that with solidarity across the continent, they will be able to push for this change. And I think they did so.
Thank you very much. Doc, before we even come to the fall of the Berlin Wall, what are some of the achievements that this convention or this coming together of states were able to accomplish? What are some of the things they were able to accomplish then?
Well, Dr. Manning said they were a force to reckon with. They were a kind of a third way, whereby you have the West, you have the East, and these are what? States or powers. So their voice was important. They could speak to issues. But if we want to say what they have really achieved,
Then
there were certain states or political leaders who were harassed. A person like Fidel Castro of Cuba, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, and Nasser of Egypt. These were very radicals who had very different opinion from what the West or the East was doing. They had support from this group of people, so to a large extent they were not left out to dry on their own, but then they could always have support from the distance. So largely, so to say, it was a kind of symbolic political distance. Quantitatively, that is where the problem is, because the Cold War policy was such that, and the weakness of the most of the countries which were in the non-alignment were such that it was very difficult for anyone to be truly independent. For example, when we say Cuba is a member of NAM, then you talk of the Cuban missile crisis, whereby the Soviet Union moved missiles very close to United States of America. Then when you talk of, you call him Sukarno, I say Suharto, that is the Indonesian distant. And he was dyed in wool a Westerner, to the extent that he was able to annex East Timor for several years without the West raising a voice. And when you talk of South Korea, they were equally distant. And you come to talk of Turkey. Turkey was part of NATO. So in reality, it was more symbolic kind of contribution that NAM did or gave to member states that were at some times on the wrong side of politics. But when you come to in terms of qualitative terms, I don't think that much was done that we can distinctly, for example, talk about Pan-Africanism's achievements and say NAM has achieved so and so and so. There were a political movement, and most of the time, that was the influence that they had in the international system, whereby the major powers have to listen to them or to cut their indulgence, so to say. Thank you.
Doc, it is in the literature that Varco and Akosombo, Kwame Nkrumah was able to get it from the United States through his economic diplomatic prowess that he engaged with John F. Kennedy. Again, when he came to the Black Star Line, he went to the Soviet Union to get the ships for the Black Star Line. Had it not been his theoretical decision to be neutral in the international system, would he have gotten this from both sides of the ideological aisle?
I think we have to be careful when we use the word neutrality, because Nkrumah himself uses the word positive neutrality.
Okay.
And in the first NAM conference, they made a distinction between being neutral and being non-aligned. They didn't want to be neutral like Switzerland.
Okay.
They wanted to be non-aligned.
Okay.
And they wanted to be non-aligned vis-a-vis the powers, but they wanted to be extremely dynamic, expressive of what they call their interest, the collective interest. And they defined it. They defined their collective interest as decolonization. They defined their collective interest as making sure that there is economic development and that the economic system which was dominated by the powers changed. And they also defined one of their goals to be able to show solidarity to each other, so that they will be able to hold their own against the dominant forces. So Nkrumah was able to be non-aligned at the time as part of the movement, but he was able to negotiate. If you are non-aligned, it means you pursue only your interest. So if your interest will be in the East, you go to the East, and if your interest in the West, you go to. Even one of his statements in the UN, and his major statement in the UN, he said what Ghana wanted was to develop, and they need assistance to be developed. If they can't find it in the West, they wouldn't mind going to the East. So it was a clear point which, in my opinion, can be looked at within the context of what the non-aligned movement really is. We are not aligned, we are pursuing our interest as we see and deem fit. And honestly, the movement, you should consider it as a movement, not as an organization. It's a movement, so that it changed as it went along. When it was created, when they met in 1961, their interest was not to be part of a bloc, right? But at the same time, they were a bit diffident about whether being part of a treaty or military alliance would have made you aligned. In 1964, they defined it clearly that if you don't have it, if you're not part of Warsaw Pact and you are not part of NATO, then you are non-aligned. In spite of the fact that you may have some military treaties like the African-speaking country, French-speaking countries, for example, with France, that did not prevent them from being part of the movement. So some of them were part of the movement.
But this France issue, what is his name? De Gaulle,
yes,
actually took away all the French that was with NATO when he took over, so that he could also have some kind of neutrality.
Yes.
So doesn't that fall in line?
Oh, that influenced the decision of the 1964 NAL conference in Cairo, because they mentioned it. Because they mentioned that the Gaullist attitude, in which the Gaulle foreign policy or the Gaulle's foreign policy seemed to be aligned to those of the non-aligned, because he refused to be aligned to NATO or to Warsaw, and that was a major element that they put in. They also added to the fact that France had consented at that time to give independence to Algeria, so that was a major achievement. In other words, I just want to point out the fact that it's a movement. It changes, it moves, but it pursued clear objectives, and the clear objectives were the capacity to be able to express what their interests were without any fear of being dominated or being shut up. They put it, they put in the word like without the expression of their interests being confined by the two blocs.
Right.
So I think in that sense, I think it's also
Doc,
point.
thank you. Doc, you look at this whole thing again, and you say that the United States and the Soviet Union, you smaller states or weaker states have decided to come together to stay, there's a positive neutrality, so to speak.
Yeah.
What did they do? What did the Soviet Union and the United States do to impede or to enhance the activities of the NAM?
Well, personally, I think it's just a play on words to talk about the difference between neutrality and then non-aligned.
Okay.
The examples I've given, for example, the sighting of missiles in Cuba.
Okay.
I don't see how that will be a neutral act and or can be a non-aligned act. The point is that the West and the East invariably carried out their policies. Their national interests or ideological interests was what influenced their daily dealing with the developing countries. If they have to undermine a country because that country they feel is aligned with what the East, they did, just as they overthrew Nkrumah. And then when it comes to countries like Guinea or Sekou Touré, the French pulled the rug under Guinea, and it became one of the poorest in Africa. Then when you go to Zaire or the former Congo, the Belgian Congo, when they were to hand over power, because of the resources that were there, they didn't want to hand over power. And we saw what happened when Kwame Nkrumah felt that the African Union and other organizations to take the lead. Invariably, we became part of the conflict and that sort of thing. So to a large extent, for me, NAM was more in the service of some head of states who wanted their voice to be heard. But to a large extent...
But Dr. Not to cut you.
Yeah.
If you look at one of the objectives, decolonization, now we have Angola, where the dawn of independence, it had a whole lot of issues, and colonizers, US had to use South Africa and all that to intervene. Cuba stepped in. What's part of the decolonization steps?
Yeah, the point is that, you see, there is something we, in social science we call counterfactual. And there are a lot of ambivalent organizations.
Okay.
The independence of African countries, should it be attributed to non-aligned movement or to the Organization of African Union?
But what was Cuba doing?
Should it be aligned to what? Pan-African movement or to NAM? These are where we have problems. So everybody, it is NAM that led the way in Angola. And someone can claim it's Pan-Africanists that led the way in Angola.
But what about the fact, the actual fact that Cuba was there?
Cuba was there mostly because of ideology. If you go into Che Guevara, that sort of thing, they were propagating socialist policies as against the Western exploitation of the resources that they have. And that is where I have the problem, whereby you have taken one of the major powers' ideologies, which is communism or socialism, to propagate it in Angola in order to defeat the capitalist elements that are the Savimbi and his group. Then you tell me that that is non-aligned achievement. It's for me, it begs the question.
Okay, no, come back to you. That's so clear. But Doc,
yes.
Recently, in one piece, you realize that his godfather was actually Opoku-Amaning. His godfather was actually Opoku-Amaning. Opoku-Amaning was also a member of NAM. And while the Cubans, who were NAM, members, a member state of NAM, were helping the MPLA, Augustino Neto, Opoku-Amaning was actually helping Jonas Savimbi. How does that make the organization a realistic organization? That was purposeful.
Okay, let me put it this way. I said earlier on, it's a movement. So a movement means there is a room for evolution, for changes.
Okay.
Uvobanye wasn't looked upon with much favor in the first came to exist in 1961. Most of the people who drove the ideologies of NAM, the few who were Africans, were those who invariably joined what created what you call the Casablanca group.
Yeah.
Right. So they were the radicals. And in fact, the non-aligned movement in 1961 appeared to be packed more with people who challenge Western interests than people who would condone Western interests. Their ideas were very clear. They were not happy with the world order as it existed. They were unhappy on three counts. They felt that bloc system was the search and the continuation of hegemony. So they were, and it was dangerous to world peace. So whereas not all of them would put as much emphasis on hegemony and all that, some did. Nkrumah was putting more emphasis on decolonization and the support that it should get from NAM, whereas Nehru was more concerned about the bloc systems and its threat, and Tito and Nasser probably were the dualists who carried this thing through. So there were differences in terms of what people would consider to be the emphasis. Clear that what they were pursuing was obviously. Now, with the case, by the time they got to 64, you should first understand the movement was instrumental in the creation of the Group of 77. The Group of 77 was an instrument which the non-aligned movement or the radicals, you know, people were challenging the economic world order through the conferences that were held in 64 in Cairo, the works that Raprabish, the alliance that through NAM were created between the Asians and the Latin Americans by 1964. They have come to the understanding that numbers counted in the United Nations. And that is why they needed to open it up for those who the normal circumstances in 3 years or so would be looked upon with not much favor. They were allowed to come in. I said because the goal had changed and a few things they overlooked, and numbers, there was comfort in numbers.
Doc,
and therefore they came in.
Wasn't that diluting?
No. In my opinion, that was strategic. Because it made the Group of 77 very in the United Nations, and especially in Geneva, where the new economic order was being discussed. And one of his major achievements was the creation of UNCTAD. Right? And since that time, all the conferences those of us who are a bit old, happened even to be and we saw Ambassador Agbehu and the others, how they were instrumental in the negotiations on the world economic order, on the commodity prices, how the changes and all that. And you know,
talking about the new international
economic order. So all these things were movements towards that. In my opinion, we should know the contribution to the international order that we have now.
No, but let me just come in briefly. Probably I'm a critical theorist, so that's why maybe different. When you look at the new international economic order, the problems of development that the world was facing, and they actually articulated it. But then the realization of that distance again call on them for help to. So in the end, nothing was done at all. Nothing in substantial terms. Nothing was achieved. On paper, a lot was achieved, was written.
Was the group an isolationist group?
No.
No, it was not. The I was saying, particularly even during the Cold War, the Western world had the sway because of the resources available to them or the riches that they have. So sometimes they are allowed these NAM and other peripherals as a talk shop, and they allow them to talk, but in the end, apart from the symbolic achievement that is achieved, substantive came out of it. And as a student, when I was studying the new international economic order, what surprises me is that we criticize somebody largely, and then the ways of achieving what we set out to achieve was again dependent on the people using their resources for us to achieve that.
Doc, I'll come back to that. We move, but before that, Doc, concerning at the UN, the group of 77, you know, that's a huge voting bloc at the time. But we also know that when it comes to the UN, the Security Council has more teeth.
Effective in the General Assembly,
yes,
but
the Security
not.
Council, that actually,
I mean, that's the powerhouse.
Yes,
they are not effective.
Look, let me put it this way. The world we see now is not the world we saw 100 years ago. And it was not done because somebody just decided one day that the world 100 years ago was unfair. We were not even considered as human beings. Today I was just looking at some French commentary which a communist had done in the 1920s about how in Ivory Coast people were killed because they had not paid enough taxes and all that. It just passed. People didn't care. So talk sometimes means something. The fact that people met and they decided that we don't go to school, that we've decided that we would demand a change and we will obtain a change, was already an awakening. The fact that you're asking the Western world to contribute to the welfare of the weaker states, that they should pay for it, we are not asking for charity. Now what we're being said everywhere, even in America, even in Europe, that the money exploitation. Whoever would have thought that in Europe, in England, people would be toppling statues of people who were slave owners, and now calling on the churches that benefited from slavery that they should now account for it. So it's important. Even if Parliament, the General Assembly is just a talking shop, it is changing how the world is seen, how people think, and now the youth all over the world are beginning to think differently. You see what I mean? Capacity to talk, to organize, and to let people know what is happening is important.
And was progressive.
Yes.
Okay. Now we are moving to the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now we've moved from when the group was established and some of the events that took place. Now we are coming to the fall of the Berlin Wall. In fact, very few political analysts could predict the fall of the Berlin Wall. It surprised a lot of people. Even though they saw, some of them could talk about the weaknesses in the Soviet Union, they didn't know that under Gorbachev it would just collapse and the Berlin Wall will fall. But it did. At that time, a group that has been established to stay away from the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc were now faced with a unipolar world controlled by virtually the United States. How was the situation and how non-aligned movement, Doc?
Well, I don't think specifically it's a question of how it affected the non-aligned movement. But the whole world was without direction at the end of the Cold War, because even the Western system, all their strategies were built on how to fight the East. So at the end of it, the question was, which is the enemy that we are going to fight, or which we are going to face? And this is where the Green Peril issue came about. Then the developing world realized that they have a condition that is meeting the needs of the Western world, which to them, that bargaining power that the Eastern world stood for, or the alternative choice that existed, had gone. So there were a lot of chaos in the international system and that sort of thing. My question, my problem is that I want us to look at the end of the Cold War perspective than looking at it purely from a non-aligned movement perspective. From that perspective, more issues will come. But then, largely what happened there is that I felt that there was no more any reason for the non-aligned movement. As it was, there was no reason for Warsaw Pact. And internationally, the West, a lot of people believe that even NATO should have disbanded. And NATO staying on now has created more problems for the world. And even now with the France, Australian issue that has emerged, there is a bigger problem for them. So I think that NAM should have folded up. There are new organizations like the Group of 20, the South-South Cooperation, the BRICS have emerged. These are movements or organizations that, given the change that the world has undergone, we should look at. And most importantly, the problem is that in the 1960s, almost all the NAM countries or developing countries, that time they were called the third world countries, they were almost pari passu at the same economic level. Today, as we talk, India is the 8th largest economy in the world. At some point in time, China was flirting with NAM movement, and China is now the 2nd largest economy in the world.
Yeah, we'll come to current contemporary issues. We want to talk a little about the Cold War when it ended and the challenges that was emerging. So, Doc, what's your take on that?
With regard to non-alignment?
Yes, as in
look,
the end of the Cold War.
I think that the Cold War, with the fall of the Berlin Conference, the collapse of the Soviet Union, it rather surprised quite a lot of people that they came rather precipitously. Because if NAM was set up to fight and seek that bipolarism, two blocks do not dominate the world, there was no longer two blocks.
Yes.
If the third element was that there should be decolonization, we have been decolonized.
Yeah.
And if the third element, the third element was that we wanted a new economic order in which Europe and America do not dominate everybody. In fact, a new economic order, the world economy was being opened up, and it was under discussion. As we talk now, one of the most conservative, when we were in Geneva, one of the most, we consider most conservative international organization was GATT, the General Agreement of that has become World Trade Organization, and it's headed by an African. You see, so basically, whatever we wanted, we achieved through solidarity, the capacity to vote, to lobby, to talk about it, to produce documents. In fact, documents were produced. Honestly, a lot of intellectuals were able to sensitize ourselves, our colleagues in Asia, our colleagues in Latin America, our colleagues everywhere, with various theories of how the international system was being run. So somehow or the other, new, fresh ideas were coming up, and therefore that contributed also into new perspectives that were looked at. So basically, in my opinion, we now are we've entered into a new system. And if NAM wants to be useful, then it has to look at the new system and see if there are any particular issues which prevent us from making progress, which is that we want a world of respect for equality of opportunities, and we want a world where racism is abolished, and we want a world where there is no hegemony and all that in political economics. They should come up, you know, with new ideas and fresh ideas to be pursued. But the principle or the strategy of solidarity, the strategy of organizing oneself to be able to make oneself heard a group head, your interest known, and prosecuting your interest peacefully in a forum of international discussion, for me, are the three principles that we should use for our future.
Yes, because of the fact that majority of the leaders who had pioneered NAM were not alive or had been deposed.
Yeah, sure. In 65, by 67,
and the 90s, when the Berlin Wall fell,
yes,
they were not there.
Yeah.
Was it the case that the new generation of leaders were more embroiled in their domestic affairs and trying to please, as Doc said, the West? For instance, this issue of conditionalities emerged where, oh, if you needed help, become more liberal or turn democratic and all those things. Was it not the case that then, as you said, decolonization was not necessary then?
No.
Would we also have the standard it should have been disbanded in the 90s when the Berlin Wall fell?
Actually, basically, after the second non-aligned conference in Cairo, there was none. Even the Afro-Asian meeting that was supposed to happen in 65, the pre-conference meetings that were held in Algeria, Algiers, and with Bembella leading. Bembella was deposed in 65 by October, and then Opoku-Amaning could not raise it up, and therefore the Afro-Asian solidarity also disappeared, and so all these things disappeared. I don't even think that this latest meeting, which was in Serbia, had any specific targets.
There was one NAM meeting in Ghana when Rawlings was in charge. So it didn't end in
anything significant. So I don't think this one would provided anything. But unless we identify specific issues in the international order.
That's what we're coming to. That's what we're coming to. And I'll start with you, Doc. Now we have issues like, and one very important issue that we have to tackle before we move to other issues, the rising China, or the rise of China. Now, the Cold War was as a result of the fact that after the Second World War, both the Soviet Union and the US fought on one side.
Yeah.
And they became the victors. And it was after the Second World War that these victors decided to divide the world. Now, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, China is rising. And people feel that we are going to experience a second Cold War. How does this, fall on the laps, or how should NAM receive the rise of China?
Well, I don't think that China was not seriously part of the Cold War because as at that time they were regarded as a developing world. They are still regarded as developed. China still calls itself a developing world. But as at that time, their type of communism was what we call peasant communism So the West were not so much concerned about that. Now that China has risen and has become the second largest economy, probably the most modern economy in the world today, there is a lot of conflict between them and the West. Not necessarily because of ideology. When they talk of ideology, they say they are not democratic enough. That is that their financial institutions and policy making doesn't pass the litmus test of that of the West. But what they are concerned about is that China is growing in stature militarily, ideologically, through many ways, media and all sorts of things, and there is this concept of what we call hegemonic decline, and it has been predicted long ago that the Western world, particularly United States of America, will not be the leader of the world. Recently, it was said to be in 2060, China will take over as the leader of the world. And in after COVID, it has been brought forward that probably by 2030, China will be the leader of the world. So the West,
in terms of the economics,
economic distance, because the way China recovered from the COVID, it's been very dramatic, and they use draconian means of stopping it. And the West, they still have problems with how to manage it because of the normative or liberal way people can choose to have vaccine or not to have vaccine. In China, if vaccine is there, you have it. You don't have a choice. So the Western world is actually aligning in a way as to clip China's wings, not to overtake and feel what? You know, this hegemonic theory, we don't have to go into academic things here. They will supply the international system with their values and all kinds of things, and this is why they feel that it will undermine their leadership. So because of that, in the Western world, there is a policy called the Coming Great Powers War. And what they are doing now is to mobilize Australia, mobilize India, Japan, and a number of countries so that they can what? Bring China's economic development and progress down. And we have a shoot in the foot, that is the Australia-France submarine agreement that Biden has taken. So what is happening now is a form of rapprochement on the part of Biden as to appear not to be jingoistic towards China. But whether that will amount to a Cold War, I don't think it will be a Cold War as it was ideologically, because China is thoroughly a capitalist state. Their system of production, marketing, and everything is capitalist. It's only, as one of their foreign ministers said, that when a country is changing, it's like a vehicle. When you spark it, it will do good things, but there is a need for a human being to be in charge as the driver to control where the car goes. And that is what China is doing. So it will bring a lot of problem to Africa, because China's involvement in Africa is one thing that is alarming the Western world. We have been their playground. Our natural resources, though they have a lot of synthetic alternatives, our resources, especially the special F, which is the engine of growth, is found in Africa. So when these problems come, there are two things are possible to happen. One is that we'll be caught in the middle as we were caught during the Cold War, or the Western world will become more benevolent towards Africa in order to win hearts and minds in Africa. So by so doing, we may benefit from the quarrel or the trouble between China and then the Western world. But then it depends on how our leaders position themselves, what part they play in the ensuing conflict between China and the West, and that is how we will benefit.
Doc, thank you so much. Doc, then NAM went into hibernation.
Yes.
Is it not that, from what we've heard, is it not that NAM should just wake up from hibernation and start positioning itself for what is about to happen? Because I don't see the commonality in markets. That is, as in China is also capitalist. It doesn't really matter, because if they are still at loggerheads, they are at loggerheads. If Ghana decides to be at loggerheads with Cote d'Ivoire, it doesn't matter the similarity that we have a primary production capacity. We are all producing cocoa. If we are at loggerheads, we have loggerheads. And if Togo wants to take sides, it will still take sides. So are we supposed to just look on and say that, well, because of the similarity in markets, they are all capitalists, so let's just allow them? Or we should position ourselves for what is to come?
Look, there are two ways of looking at the world system. You look at the what we call the realpolitik, the realistic, manner. Or you look at it, it's a real, or you look at it in the idealistic manner. Okay. I happen to try to be dualist, join the two, and maybe my several decades with the UN has also made me a bit of an idealist. We don't have to have conflict. When we can avoid it, we have to avoid it. The world is not destined to have two forces always fighting each other. Right? What are they? They used to fight.
That it started the Peloponnesian War.
Yes, sure, yeah. And what I'm saying is, it is not it is not something that we should say is inevitable with the destiny of human. It is our psyche, and therefore, if we work towards a new vision, a different vision of how wealth should be created, how wealth should be distributed, the importance of this earth for all of us, the new sort of the knowledge that we have now, that we have a little speck in, you know, a whole huge myriads of galaxies that we do have. I think we should start asking ourselves, is there an alternative? And after the Second World War, the vision that the Americans had of wanting a different system where it is not a winner takes all,
of course,
where we collectively manage this earth and the relationships that exist, that we commit ourselves to certain ideals, that is, that there should be freedom for all, there should be justice for all, we are not condemned to live in poverty, that we can all work together to raise standards of living, that there's a minimum decency and dignity that human beings should have, that we all have human rights. Our right to be here, and our right to pursue our happiness, and our right to have access to opportunities. It may sound idealistic, but we can organize ourselves along it. Already the UN is working on such principles. The UN is meeting heads of states talking about it. It looks as if those who brought these ideas seem to be walking away from it, from the idea of a common world with a common management based on certain values that will hold together, when it does not suit them. It does not necessarily mean that all of us should walk away. Somehow I do believe that using the UN system and the vision that we have, we can gradually work towards a system which is the only way by which humanity will survive. We know that if we create systems by which two hegemonies fight, the world is finished.
Well, I think
before that, okay. Some of the viewers are joining us, and one of them is saying that this program provides very useful and insightful information on Africa and international studies. As a final year PhD student in international studies, I encourage you to continue with this program into perpetuity, just like Talking Points program. God bless your team. From Blessed Ashmont, PhD student, University of Cape Coast. God bless you too.
Thank you.
And then from Abraham Ofori, the non-aligned movements, its purpose and functions, was and is still a powerful tool to neutralize member countries from the claws of the Western capitalists and Eastern communists. Well, they're still communists. And Abraham Ofori again, China's rise has been inevitable and is the result of the vision of late Chairman Mao and the Communist Party. China's rise will gradually diffuse the powers of the existing world powers. The lesson to Africa and members of the NAM is to curb the teeming influence of China across the globe by pursuing long-term development goals. Thank you, Abraham.
I just wanted to add, finish my statement off by saying that we are not condemned to live in a bipolar. India, as he said, is also a rising destiny. We can also rise. So we're not necessarily going to be two nations fighting each other. It can be 4, it can be 5.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
So the only point is how we can organize ourselves so that conflict doesn't.
So Doc is advocating multipolarity.
Yes.
My issue is that I am an African, and I want, despite that the cosmopolitan view of norms embedded in the UN is correct, we must think as Africans. And the question is that we have enough institutions that are emerging that we have to.
Yeah.
At the end of the Second World War in Japan, they were so poor that people would be walking on the street and collapse and die. So they had ships which carried people to different countries. But Japan and Ireland became the second largest economy. China was ignored. People laugh at Chinese wherever Chinese products were. Today, they are somewhere. The point is that we have to what? Know what our needs are as an Africans. Today, we have the African Free Trade Area. We are producing almost nothing in Africa. But we are importing everything from the world. Let our leaders under the African Union make it a policy to China, to European Union, that the things that we import, the factory should be created in Africa for people to work, while we have things that we need coming from here. It is the dependence of this importation. If you know the amount of money we spend, why we are so much tied to this foreign exchange, these are the things. These are kind of ideas that our leaders need to do. Than we now wholesalely selling our raw materials without value to people and just taking money, and this money being dissipated all over the place. So as African leaders, we see what is happening in Rwanda. We can talk about it, that is not democratic and whatnot, but they are making progress. You don't go to Rwanda and people are walking on the street without jobs. So we have to identify. That's why I'm not interested in this now, which is a global thing. I want Africa to rally around the African Union. I want West Africa to rally around ECOWAS. Things that are close to home, whereby we know what we need, what our problems are, and try to solve it, than going, spending resources against chasing a non-existing organization like NAM, that we were the founders, and what the founders are gone. And the count now, look at the emerging economies. Qatar. Qatar has a national population of 350,000 people, but daily the air traffic in in Qatar is 1 million. And these are emerging economies. We were all at the same level. So we need to think outside the box and stop thinking that multilateral organizations, IMF, World Bank, UN, once we are made, no, we should think about what we are, who we are, our history, what it is, and how we want to move forward. We have enough organizations in Africa that we can mobilize our dreams, efforts, and resources around and bring real change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doc.
I fully agree with you.
Yes. Doc, now there are some issues. Issues of climate change, COVID. Some of us thought that when they met in Belgrade, maybe this is the reigning issue. Maybe some vaccines could have been flying around so that we got more, because we are still not having enough. How can NAM position itself if it doesn't want to even die out? How can it position itself to tackle these contemporary issues that are, facing its citizens?
Look, I don't necessarily believe that we need to have NAM as a separate organization. As I said, it was a movement.
Okay.
And it was a movement that was seeking to achieve solidarity among people with common interests. We now have structures. NAM did not have. We now have institutions in the UN all over the world that would allow us to achieve the same purpose of being able to work together in solidarity, of being able to impact the world system positively. And as Doc said, that the general situation we are operating in as independent countries, at least on continental and regional levels, we have enough institutions for us to be able to work seriously within our nations and within our regions and within the continent, to be able to pursue the very interest that NAM sought to pursue, which is economic development. If we want to be able to impact the world, we need to have the capacity. In foreign policy, if you want to be respected, and you must have the capability. That is what we need to build now. If we want to solicit external support in our struggle to be able to build our economies and all that, there are only 3 areas which I think we can look at. Climate change is for everybody, it's not for only us. In fact, we are not the cause. We can probably demand that somebody be paid to us for they making our lives impossible. And if that is the case, we can also demand that similar amount of money should be, huge amounts of money should be paid to us.
That's right.
For the subjugation we've gone through, for the exploitation we've gone through, for all that and all that. We could also demand that. But these are another here, not there. The most important thing is that, as we say in Akan, the Mwedino, Anko, the Akano, what is here is enough for us to be able to build our continent so that we would also become, a bloc that will be reckoned with, that will be actors that would also impact the world, and probably for the better, because of the experience that we've had. Maybe we may not seek to exploit people, to subjugate people. We may we will be more prone to justice, we'll be more prone to fairness, we will be more prone to respect of human rights and others. So that is how I see it.
Doc, so your last word, the way forward for NAM, if you think that there's a way forward for it, and if not, what?
Well, I don't think the reason why NAM was created still exists. And but then, as I pointed out earlier on, we have South-South cooperation, we have the African Union, we have ECOWAS, and then we have Pan-African movement that is ongoing. We can carry out the same views or policies through this institution than not necessarily going back to NAM. I was going to make a point on this environment issue. In the 80s, it was judged that hundreds of millions of dollars will slow down these Sahara spread towards the littoral states. Now, it has gone into billions. The point is that when we depend on the outside world for our well-being, nothing will be done. We have to think inside ourselves and think what we can do for each other.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. So, Doc, your last word.
Oh, my last word will be that every situation is an occasion and opportunity for people to show the talents that they have. At the time when we were emerging into the international scene, we had leaders who were able to understand what the challenges were and stood up and got ahead. In fact, NAM basically became names and personalities that were mentioned. Sukarno, Nkrumah, Nasser, Tito, Nehru, Bandara Naik. All these names became what known as the people who refused to war. Today we don't hear such names for specific missions that would improve the world. And I would be happy that we get new crop of leaders in Africa who will be fighting corruption, who will be showing inventiveness and commitment to Africa, who will be showing that our institutions are efficient and will be making difference in our lives and will banish poverty.
Banishing poverty is the last phrase for this discussion. But before that, there's this message that I have to read. From Seth La. Africa countries in the non-aligned movements generally seem to lag behind in pursuing industrialization programs that will strengthen their economies and therefore being able to stand firm on their own economically. The Nkrumah era embarked on some measure of industrialization, utilizing Ghana's resources Ghana's raw materials, and the success then was evidenced in the numerous quality goods on display during the first international trade fair in February 1967. Now we need to strategize to catch up in industrialization with countries like India. Late Professor Francis Alote thought that Ghana was well ahead of most of the Asian tigers in the 1960s and the 1970s. That is said from La. Thank you. Good evening. Great program. I love it. Kevin here from Jolu. Public administration students. My question is, will Africa ever unite? Okay. Will Africa ever unite and live under a leadership similar to Gaddafi, where citizens earn money for a living out of a single mineral, which was oil? There are several other messages, but we are far behind time. This brings us to the end of this program. My name is Fidel Amachi Ahorsu, and I was with Dr. Ken Ahorsu. He is a senior research fellow with the Legon Center for International Affairs and Diplomacy, University of Ghana. And then we were with Dr. Kingsley Opoku-Amaning. He has been a former UN resident coordinator for several African countries, including Guinea, Chad, Sudan, and other countries. Thank you very much. Meet you same time next week. Bye.